Venice Wagner, and I'm a journalism professor at San Francisco State University. I'll be your moderator this evening. I am the co-editor and co-author of Reporting Inequality, Tools and Methods for Covering Race and Ethnicity. We have two contributors to that book here with us as well. Jeff Kelly Lowenstein, if you could raise your hand. And then Alden Laurie also. Somebody brought the book. I'm so glad. I just wanted to thank you very much for being here and being able to discuss what we're going to talk about. As far as format, after I introduce the panelists, it'd be great if you guys could keep your questions toward the end. If there's something really urgent, of course I'll stop, and if there's something that needs explaining, I would stop. But I think for flow, it would be better if we just continue with the discussion. So I have here Jeff Kelly Lowenstein. He's an award-winning investigative journalist, author, and assistant professor of journalism at Grand Valley State University. His work has been published in The New Yorker, USA Today, the Center for Public Integrity, among many other publications. Jeff has participated in national and international fellowships about racial justice, the environment, health, business, and trauma. He's a Fulbright scholar, specialist, and teacher, and he has written and edited 6 books. We also have Alden Laurie. He is the senior editor of the Race, Class, and Communities desk at WBEZ, Chicago's NPR member station. The desk provides enterprising reporting on race and class, as well as housing, immigration, demographics, employment, and opportunity. Before Alden started at WBEZ, he served as the director of research and evaluation for the Metropolitan Planning Council. There he examined and wrote about population loss, demographic shifts, job trends, and racial segregation. And we'll be talking a little bit, or I should say a lot, about segregation today. He has also been lead investigator and policy analyst for the Better Government Association. And in addition to that, he spent 12 years at the Chicago Reporter as a reporter, then senior editor, and finally as publisher. We also have Terry Avesu. She is the VP of Content for Univision Chicago, where she oversees the station's News and Creative Services department. She drives strategy for content across platforms and develops messaging and solutions for both internal and external clients. Under her leadership, Univision Chicago became the first Spanish language television station in that market to be awarded the Emmy for Best Evening Newscast. She founded a fellowship with DePaul and the McCormick Foundation to train high school and college Latinos interested in media, and in 2015 launched the first Chicago radio station for bilingual millennials. While at Telemundo, she launched the local and national AM and weekend newscast. And then we have Fernando Diaz. He is the editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter. Before joining the Reporter in November 2018, Diaz was the managing editor of digital at San Francisco Chronicle. He was a 2004 graduate of Columbia College, Chicago, and a former reporter intern. Diaz has worked at Chicago Now, OI, the Daily Herald. He was a reporter at the Democrat and Chronicle and a senior editor for investigations at Reveal, which is the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is based on the West Coast. So we have a pretty esteemed panel here. And I'd like to start out just by asking this first question, sort of pulling in the poetry that we heard, which was pretty much about identity. So I'm wondering what you can say about identity and how it plays a role in coverage of racial communities and communities of color. Can we start with you, Terry?
Hello. I was born and raised in Miami. My family, my grandparents came to this country from Cuba in the 1960s, and my parents both came as children. So when you grow up in Miami and you when you grow up in Miami, I figured out when I was 35, when I moved to Chicago, that I actually wasn't white. Okay, which people laugh, because then I said, well, what color am I? And they said to me, you're brown. And I was like, well, oh my God, so white must be transparent then, because, and I want to give a shout out to, I thought that the first girl to give the poem, she just nailed it. I mean, I felt like, girl, you got me. Oh my God, I totally get it. The one that was Mexican and then Cherokee and what box do you want to put me in and all those funky things. Okay, I oftentimes feel like I've lived being the majority. I've lived being what I thought was white. I live now being what it is to be brown and covering communities where that is. And those labels are really freaking confusing, you know? And I just, many times just, I'm like, you know what, separate. And I think that I would have never had the appreciation that I have had I stayed in Miami, because of being able to come to Chicago and see, one, I got to see this community with a whole new set of eyes. And then two, I also got to see what I left behind with a whole new set of eyes. And what I have really learned, I think, is that I oftentimes have never judged what I don't understand. And then I'm all the time feeling like, what am I missing? What am I assuming here? What am I not getting, right? Like there were words that for me meant one thing and for somebody else means something completely different, right? And I think that when we talk about, just to bring it full circle on what you're talking about, I think that the understanding of that gives me pause to just about everything and everyone that comes before me, to first look at my own biases. Because here's the thing, being female and being Latina doesn't mean that I don't have my own biases. I've got them, right? We're not free from them ourselves. And so the first thing that, both in reporting and also, you know, so much of my background as a journalist first, and then second, you know, I really have gone more into management, has fed into that understanding that I cannot hire people just like me only. I mean, we would totally fail in Chicago if I hired people just like me. Totally fail. I have hired only people, not only people, I don't want to say that that's not true. I always look for people from Chicago before I look for somebody from outside, because I understand that's my weakness and that they can help supplement that. But what I think when we talk about diversity and ethnicity, just because you are the minority doesn't mean you don't have biases yourself. So it means that all of us have to be conscious and take pause to that when reporting or even when managing and selecting the people who are going to be in our newsroom.
Alden?
You were asking about
Identity, how?
You were asking about identity. The microphone is on, I think?
Yes,
okay.
We hear you.
Thank you. Yes, so it's interesting. I think in the world of journalism, identity, particularly racial identity, is sometimes very invisible, in the sense that you can read stories, or journalists sometimes approach stories, and they never take into account the identity of the individuals that they're reporting on or the communities that they're reporting on. And then there are times when they do take into account that, and it's very surface level. But there is a presumption that if you are talking about an African American community, that there are a lot of things that come along with that. Like, all you have to do is say it's a black community, and that will communicate a whole bunch of other things that you don't even have to say. The journalists will feel that as they're reporting it, and then their audiences will pick that up as they read it. And I will stick with African American just for a moment, because I think it's very interesting. To me, it is perhaps the most, of our racial groups, the most eclectic and diverse mix of people, but there's a very common perception about black communities. Piece of research I did when I was at MPC, we were looking at 4 factors that we thought had or at least part of the equation for the violence that we were seeing in certain parts of the city. So we looked at the level of income that were in those communities, the amount of unemployment, the amount of poverty, and college education. And what we found was that if you were above, essentially we took note if you were above the median for the city or below the median for the city, and you got points if you were above the median for the positive, quote unquote, positive factors, and a point if you were below the median for the negative factors. So in African American, in Black Chicago, there were census tracts that had 4, and there were census tracts that had 0, and they were right next to one another. And so if you're reporting about a community, and I believe one of the communities like that was South Shore, Chatham, kind of in the southeast side part of town. So if you're reporting on these black communities, and when you talk about them being black and that is projecting a certain image, it could be no further than the truth depending on where you are within those communities. So we don't pay enough attention to it, and when we do pay attention to it and mention it as a profession, we don't give context, we don't dig deeper, we don't give the audience something more than just that simple label. And so the thing that we heard from some of the young people earlier today was that how that label can be it can be a misnomer in some respects. So.
And let me just interrupt here, because I think that's really fascinating. What you're saying is that the blacks are often treated as a monolith, right? But
yeah, the way we vote, the
right,
way what
exactly.
we eat, what music we like, So.
Latinos too.
And this also fits into what you're saying, Terry, that often whites are sort of blobbed together. It's like, what is white? What does that really mean?
And I think Latinos are too. I think every ethnic group is often misunderstood for all the layers that it presents. There's so many layers to it. That's what makes it so complicated, right?
Mm-hmm. Jeff.
Well, I'm really honored to be here tonight, and I wanted to first acknowledge Venice on her leadership in bringing the group together and in co-editing this really important book, which I know I've held up once already.
I didn't pay him to do that.
Not yet, no. No, but it's really beautiful to be here, especially with friends and brothers and teachers like Alden and Fernando, who have really helped me grow a lot in these questions that we're talking about together, and to reconnect with Terry on the panel and people here in the room. And I just think this is a very important conversation to have at any time, but particularly at this moment where we are in our local and national community. I think it's very important. So I'm very grateful to be here. And I also want to say how much I enjoyed and admire the work of Beautiful Minds. So could we also, one more time, please applaud for Beautiful Minds. And I think what I would say is that the concluding point, which was kind of running throughout and is already coming through our conversation, is that point about assumptions are lame. And so it's particularly in general, but particularly in terms of racial identity, and we're talking about ethnic identity as well. So this is one of many areas in which Fernando has taught me. So after Alden, Fernando, and I all worked together at the Chicago Reporter, and then Fernando went on to a number of different places and ended up at OI, and he was the editor, so he basically recruited me to be a database and investigative editor. So it took a little while, was sad to leave the Reporter, Alden and I hugged, everything quite emotional, okay. But
Was that Fernando who did
and so I was talking to Fernando before I started about the projects I had lined up and I was excited about, and I said, Fernando, we'll do this about the Latino community, and this about the Latino community, and this about the Latino community. And Fernando said, time out, Jeff. I don't want to assume that our readers only want to learn about themselves. And that to me was a very profound insight, because basically he's saying, I want to bring a broad view of what's happening in the world to our readers. But also what he was saying is that it's very important for people who are not in the community to care about what's happening in each neighborhood. And so that conversation that we're already beginning, to me, speaks to that and speaks to what Beautiful Minds was talking about. And to me, as a reporter and as someone who in our society benefits in many ways from the unfair structures that exist in terms of being white, in terms of being male, coming from an upper middle class background, being straight, being able-bodied, all those types of privileges means that for me, it's very important for me not to assume when I enter a community or relationship, and I'm very privileged that we have Reverend Hood here and Evangelist Hood, who we've known for many years. We'll talk a little bit about some of the projects we've done. But that when you enter that community and those relationships, it's very important to do so with humility, to do so with openness, to do so with respect, and to do so in a way that you're showing that you understand what you do not know, and that the folks who are in those areas have a lot to teach you, and that they have the privilege of their own experiences, they have the benefits of their knowledge, and so there's really something very powerful when people choose to share those things with you. That is something that they are conferring onto you. And so I think that's my initial thoughts in terms of resonating with identity and reporting. The last thing I just wanted to mention was that when I was talking about the book coming out with my wife, she said, well, if we're going to do something in Chicago, maybe Venice should connect with public narrative. So can we please honor my wife for that idea? Thank you very much, honey. She's in the back looking slightly uncomfortable at the moment.
Well, I am also honored to be here. I joked that I was going to be sharing the stage with family because Alden hired me at The Reporter as a reporter. I actually stole Jeff. He didn't just come over, I stole him. Terry and I worked together when I was the editor of OI. We co-distributed an investigation into the temp industry here, which we'll talk a little bit about, and how discrimination manifests itself, and how racism manifests itself, and how people look to hide those things. And I would just say, to add to the assumptions are lame, is nuance is hard, and identity is beyond. It's a meta manifestation of race. I grew up in Maryland. My father's from Spain. My mother's from Paraguay. I was raised in an affluent white suburb. I went to an all-boys Jesuit high school where I was Mexican because I spoke Spanish. Then I moved to Chicago for college. Then I ran a newspaper that was geared toward the Mexican community. I hired an English-speaking Jewish data editor to do that. And, you know, to Terry's point, I mean, and I think to some of what the young people were saying in their poems, like, I'm not Mexican. I am a homeowner in Pilsen, which is one of the epicenters of the gentrification debate right now. Am I gentrifying or am I the gentrified? It's so hard to do these stories because at some point there's an inch count. At some point, there's a word count. At some point, there's an interest level. And being able to tell large stories means that it's harder to tell small stories and individual stories. I think one of the best stories that I've read of the entire 2020 presidential campaign thus far was a piece out of the Washington Post, a young black reporter named Clevius Natal, who wrote about Bernie Sanders going to South Carolina and not eating the food. And
Is that true?
this is true. And the African American community had put together an event so that they could welcome the candidates, and he did not take one bite. And it was a piece about manners. It was about polls and how important the African American vote is, and yes, it might have insinuated that the black vote is up for grabs and this is a key state, but it was about manners, and it was about the fact that these folks had made this food and that he had not made a moment to go back and just say thanks, to just take a bite. And those are the stories that are really hard to do, because that's not going to get you 1 million page views. Right? That's not viral, right? But that's a story that helps make something as critical as our democracy, as votes, as culture, as identity resonate for people. And that's why I say nuance is hard, is because it's very hard, and we'll talk about this, and it's covered in your book, that selling those stories to editors, getting those stories done is really hard. And it's not because they're bad stories, but I think we in the media are conditioned that they're not interesting stories, that they're not going to travel. And so ultimately then you end up going towards the stories that talk about the black community or the brown vote or larger things that you think will have more of an impact or resonance.
See,
I would
here's the
argue-
thing, though. May I say something?
Yeah.
Because as you were saying that, I was like, oh, that's somebody who gets it, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I would have clicked on that because that is very ethnic.
Exactly.
Like,
I think that's a
I mean,
viral story, actually, right?
that's like worst sin you can ever commit.
Right.
Is like at my grandmother's house, she gives you food, you better eat it. Like, you know what I mean? You're not coming back.
Right.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, I'm surprised that story didn't go viral. It
No,
must have.
I would say it performed, but when you're a young reporter or a reporter in a newsroom pitching your editor on the 2020 campaign, the last story you can imagine pitching or getting greenlit is one about manners. You know, what you're going to look at is the campaign finance. You're going to look at the unions. You're going to look at the demographics. You're going to look at all of these other things that seem important, right? And that suggest that those things are actually drivers, but it's those things that compel people to actually vote.
But I think the selling point on that, if you're selling that to the editor, you don't talk about the manners. Really, the story is about
That's right.
how
Everything
he didn't do well
That's
with
right.
the black vote,
That's right.
or potentially didn't do well with the black
That's
vote. He
right.
did not get the engagement with the voters that he needed to
Right.
get
Right.
because of manners.
Exactly.
Okay.
But see, that's also the opportunity too, because I bet you as an editor would not have said no to that story, because I wouldn't have said no to that story. I was like, this is the human factor that connects in a way with our audience. I mean, I oftentimes look at my own responses, and as you were telling the story, it was like, there's that warm feeling when somebody does a story that they just get it, right? Like it's like you feel this connection. Well, I do TV mostly, and we do digital now, but like that, you're like, they get it. You know, like you feel warmth. There's a connection that gets made, which is so hard through this inanimate object. But doing something like that, I think an editor, this is why diversity at those higher levels to help you say, that's a great story.
I want to move on to the next thing. You know, I was watching the debates yesterday, and I was struck with racism actually coming up as a topic. Racism and structural racism. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about maybe what the difference is between racism and structural racism, and then maybe talk a little bit about how do you think journalists, or I should say the media, are making the distinction between those two things. Fernando, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I will credit Alden with waking me up to structural racism when I was a reporter under him, working on a series of stories about, we had a grant, and Alden, forgive me if I mess this up, but we had a grant to do stories at the Chicago Reporter on children of the incarcerated and what the effects of incarceration are on children. And I don't recall how we got to the story that we ended up doing, but it was basically an analysis mapping prisons and their distance from Chicago, and then trying to tabulate the number of visits that prisoners got to see if there was a correlation between the distance and the number of visits. And certainly there was. The further away from Chicago that the prison is, the less likely that prisoners were to have visits. That's a huge problem for maintaining relationships with the community, for trying to address recidivism, just a whole host of things. The fact that, you know, there are no actual bus lines or train lines to prisons, right? So just connections and transportation are a huge problem. So in doing this story, I'm learning data analysis, I'm learning mapping from Alden, I'm learning all of these things. I'm not black, so I'm, feeling what Jeff was describing, riding buses for 8 hours back and forth downstate with young children who are going to meet their loved ones, because this is the trip that they're going to have in 6 months, and trying to understand what that is. I mean, I could never have imagined my parents being incarcerated, right, or having to deal with such a thing. And in doing the story, I came across a master's thesis by a young person who was at Southern Illinois University. And it was about the prison expansion and how prisons came to be located downstate. And the reason is because these towns were all vying for the jobs that would come along with the prisons. And I came across this video called Is We Is or Is We Ain't. And the video was about whether or not they were going to get a prison. And it was a commercial for their town to basically lobby the state to locate a prison in their town. And I was horrified. I couldn't believe what I was watching, because at no point was any of the message about this is the right place to locate a prison because it's restorative, because it's going to mean that folks who serve their time there are going to benefit and we're ultimately going to improve their home communities, that it had anything to do with that. It was about jobs, and it was literally competing with other downstate white communities to incarcerate people. And it just showed me that this isn't chance, this isn't circumstance, right? Because if you really wanted to address some of those root issues, you'd put the prisons in Chicago, or you'd put them in Cook County, or you'd put them in DuPage or Lake or McHenry. Like, you'd put them closer, right? You'd locate them near transit centers so that they would be easier to get to. But that's part of the issue. And so I think part of what I'm trying to do when I'm editing or when I'm looking for stories or trying to help folks shape, are we covering racism, which can be embodied in a tweet, right? Or are we covering structures and systems that are predicated on the subjugation of people and classes of people and parts of our society? And those are two very different things. And what makes me nervous about this moment that Jeff described that we're in, where race and racism is so much of the conversation, is that I fear it tilts toward the sensational coverage of the tweet and of the message, and not an analysis and investigation into those root systems and causes that we could actually expose and try to fix. And so constantly trying to dance between, well, this is a manifestation of that, but do you cover this as a means of covering that, or do you just focus all of your energy over here? And I feel blessed and fortunate as somebody who was at the Reporter as an intern and was at the Reporter under Alden as a reporter, and am now an editor and publisher, to help people focus on that latter part, right? And say, like, let's really not worry about the circus and the sideshow, because we need to train ourselves for the battle that is going to take many more decades to wage and to win, which is, how do we address the locations of those prisons? How do we figure out how we can show people that these structures exist? They're not a circumstance, they're not a consequence. They were actually planned that way. And the more we can help people understand that, the more aware we can make new voters and other people who can make different decisions.
I'd like Alden to jump in here, since he wrote the chapter on structural racism for this book. So maybe you have some insights also to add.
So I'll try to be brief because the chapter was pretty long.
It was. But it was good.
The Aspen Institute, I thought, laid it out very well, and that was kind of my reference material for kind of describing what, and if I'm not mistaken, there were 4 different kinds of racism, and structural racism, just taking the 2 things that you talk about, racism and structural racism. So when I think about racism, I think about individual racism, person to person. Someone has said or done something that is offensive or harmful or hurtful to another individual based on their race. And when I think about structural racism, I think about, as Fernando was kind of describing, systems or structures that inherently lead to a disproportionate impact on particular groups of people, regardless of the motivation. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. And so when we in journalism use the word racism, I think most people, including the journalists who are using the term, are thinking about someone making a deliberate attempt against someone else because of the color of their skin or their racial or ethnic background, to harm that person. I'm not going to let you stay in my building. I'm not going to rent to you. I'm not going to give you this job. I'm going to call you the N-word. I'm going to call you something else because I don't like you, because I hate you. It's virulent. It's personal. It's, 1950s, 1930s, 1860s. I can go on and on. It's that kind of racism. And the problem is that today, we still get some of that because, as you talked about the sideshow, we hear about it ad nauseum, Did the governor of South Carolina wear blackface or, and it's just kind of like, I could care less. I know the KKK is out there. I know there are bigots. I know there are racists. I don't think in this room, it's bad for me to say, the person in the Oval Office is probably one of them, very clearly is one of them. That's not my concern. And as people in the journalism field, I don't think that should be our concern in sharing that information as well. We spend so much time talking about that, and we don't spend enough time talking about decisions that are made regardless of the motivation, because sometimes the motivation is very clearly to have an impact, but sometimes it's not. It's based on assumptions, or it's based on this is what good public policy is without an understanding of how that has an impact on that, on particular groups. And that's the stuff that we should be thinking about more deeply and covering more thoroughly, which we don't. We gloss over stuff way too often. We presume that Inglewood looks like it does because that's Inglewood. It's a poor black community, blah, 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 blah. Like I was saying earlier, there's the label and then everything else is automatically assumed beyond that.
It's natural. It was just natural for it to be a black community.
Right. So that would be my take on the difference in the way we think about it. And I'll add one more thing around the hyper coverage that we provide on the question of is somebody racist, because that seems to be at the core of a lot of that coverage. Is somebody racist? Did what they say or what they do is racist? And I think that is all wrapped up into this very white-centered, I think about white editors and white reporters and white news managers who are captivated by those stories and believe that that's the central question, because I believe that...
And I think they're outraged by those stories in some cases too.
Sure,
so that's what fuels that.
And this isn't I'm not saying this as a litmus test on what those people believe or what they feel or what's right or wrong. I think there is a fascination about, am I racist or not racist? That is a question that I think many white people are burdened by. And I think it's actually good for people to be burdened by that. And we get sucked into this thing in journalism about trying to answer that question. And I would hope that we would think about a more important question, which Fernando alluded to, which is this question about the structures and the systems that have a racist impact, regardless of what people are thinking about, because that's what's driving the ways in which our communities look, the differences that we see in the outcomes that we see differently for people, why Illinois has you can 9 times more likely to be incarcerated in Illinois if you're African American than if you're white. That's what structural racism brought that. There aren't tens of thousands of racist white cops or tens of thousands of racist white judges who are saying, I'm going to put every black person behind bars because I hate black people. No, these are folks who actually think they're doing the right thing because the people that come before them in certain circumstances from certain communities, and they think, this is something that I have to do. This is a structural problem that we have, not a 1950s or 1930s or I can go on and on, problem of bigots and racists who are running our country or running our systems. So that's my
Jeff, what do you think journalists can do to help get at that issue of structural racism versus racism?
Yeah, so, I agree with a lot of what Fernando and Alden have said so far.
And I'm talking like practical steps that they can take.
Yes,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you for nudging me. I think I'll focus, to answer that question, I'll focus on something that Alden taught me in the first project, one of the first projects I did, the Chicago Reporter in 2006, and Lori Glenn is here, and we worked together on that project as well. And so that was really looking at school funding in Illinois. And so for those of you who are into school funding in Illinois, there's this one district in Lake Forest called Rondout School District. And year after year, Rondout has the highest per pupil expenditure in the entire state by quite a bit of money. And then we started in looking at the story at how Rondout, this is what I write about in my chapter, how Rondout went there because they had the same test scores as a district in Ford Heights. And Rondout was very high percentage white, very high average income, and very high per pupil spending. Ford Heights, predominantly African American, lower level of spending, and so it was kind of looking at what was that initially. But when I went to Rondout, I realized there was kind of this one room or one building district, which is quite common for a lot of suburban districts in Illinois. The principal and superintendent were there, but it was surrounded by business parks. And then when I went to Ford Heights, there was very little business near the school and in the community. And so I called Alden and said, hey, Alden, I noticed that here are these two districts. I looked at what was going on in the schools, but there's these 3 business parks literally surrounding Rondout on all sides. And so he said, well, Jeff, let's look at the data and find out, is this just a story of 2 districts, or is this a story of the system of using property tax as the primary revenue source for school funding? And so we looked into it, we got the data, and what we found was that the poor districts, often poor districts of color, were actually taxing themselves at far higher rates than the wealthier districts. So Ford Heights, for example, they were charging 7% property tax. And Rondout, it was about 1.2%. Now, the element that got deeper about it was that for businesses who are choosing where to locate and are looking at a choice between, do I want to go to Lake Forest, which has nice roads, a large property tax base on the residential side, and a 1.2% tax rate, do I want to go there, or do I want to go to Ford Heights, which has a 7% property tax rate, the roads aren't as good, it's harder to get to? And so what we found was that that the residents of that community in Ford Heights, showing how much they cared about their young people and taxed themselves at those higher rates, became a disincentive for businesses to invest in that community. And so what we found was that poorer communities, the gap between the property tax on the business side was actually even bigger than the gap on the residential side. And usually when people think about property tax, you think about, oh, there are big houses in Lake Forest, so that's where all the money is coming from. But in fact, relying on that mechanism, whether it was intentional or unintentional, had a very disproportional and racially based impact. Now, the other thing that came out through this, and this is another part of the analysis that Alden guided me through on, was that downstate districts, which were often white farming districts in Illinois, also had low residential property tax, so they also taxed themselves at much higher rates, so that then became another disincentive for businesses to invest there. So what I'm saying is that thinking of that question that Alden posed to me and that I've tried to take forward of, is this just a story of one neighborhood, or is this neighborhood indicative of something larger happening? That's something that journalists and people in community can do very concretely to shift a little bit how they think. And even if there's a short time frame on the story, it can guide how you move forward in an iterative fashion, so that then over time you're continuing to come back to showing it's not just about one person, one district, but it's really about something larger that exists.
So you're really showing the pattern. You're talking about patterns.
Yeah, the pattern over time, but using that framework of, is this just about one individual instance? Is this an anecdote? Or is there something deeper underneath that? And I think that's what Alden was talking about in your comments, and that's part of what I think we can do as journalists and other people really committed to getting these issues out.
Terry, when you're working with reporters, what kind of advice do you get them to go deeper into a story to expose structural racism?
think I often ask the question of whether it's just one thing. And this is not what we put, I mean, I have to be very honest that this is not what we put out every single day. We've come to a point where we have so many newscasts a day that we've scaled back on some of the investigations. Thank God I have incredible partners and non-for-profits who come out, and that's how we actually are able to provide for our audience some of this information. But when I have done investigative pieces that go beyond that, I've always asked the same question, which is this just one thing here, or does it go across the board? And I think one example was, and I really need to credit who deserves the credit, was Fernando, when we did the one on the temp agencies and how they were doing racial discrimination, and how they were discriminating against. They preferred to hire Hispanics or Latinos versus blacks, and they had code words in order to do that. And he and his team found how that was systematic and not just one instance. I think those type of stories take longer, and so hence there has to be a dedicated team, which we had, and we are getting back there, because something I think Fernando had suggested on the call is, when you take, this is the challenge that I have, and I have to be very honest, is our television station, we get, like, take last night, ABC was #1, we were #2 regardless of language. Yet, we bill, and that means in revenue, because we are for profit and we do have to actually sell, right, to stay on and subsidize our operation. We bill 5 times less than ABC, 3 times less than CBS. CBS's ratings, I won't speak to that, but they are not where we are. And so our team is out there having to work that much harder. So sometimes I feel that it is that alone, just we want to talk about systematic discrimination, the fact that our audience has less valued and that people want to pay less for our audience than they will, because they feel that they can get them on bilinguals on English channels, okay? It's a much more complex, I don't want to get into it here, but that is one of the things that puts us, I think, at a disadvantage. And the other thing, when we talk about that, is I have often partnered with English language stations or English language non-for-profits, or even BEZ, WTTW, because when we do an investigation, and we do really great work, it's like when a tree falls in the forest, nobody hears about it. I understand that when I put out a story that is in Spanish and it uncovers something, if the rest of the community, the majority, cannot understand it in English, because it is in Spanish, even the politicians, our previous mayor asked me why we were asking questions one way, because Spanish language stations don't ask those questions normally. And I was like, well, you better get used to it, because I'm in town now. You know? But that is one of the things where as I hear them and I hear about the incredible data investigations that they do, there's a little bit of jealousy in the sense that I wish our teams could do that. We have to be very selective in what we are able to do, and we have to partner in order to be able to do that. And I think I've had to shift the way that I feel about, we are content creators, but we are also content purveyors. And if I were to take on the luxury of not putting out a story that I didn't investigate from zero by myself, right, which is oftentimes happened, then I would be robbing my community of the ability to find out about certain things. For example, how long did it take you to do the story, the investigation that you guys did on the temp when you came to me?
9 months.
I don't have that luxury to do that. It would, I don't have that luxury to do that. But we wouldn't have put something like that on the air had it not been for the partnerships that exist. So it is a very true reality for me. I don't know that I'm answering your question directly, but I need to be very honest about how things work on our side, because there is a language barrier.
And I think most of the journalists in here would agree that time is a difficulty, right? They don't have enough time. Their editor wants them to do 3 stories, not just one, and they have to do them that day. So if any of you have any suggestions of reporters who are in that situation, how do they handle that? Having to feed the beast daily and still do this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say as a former reporter and somebody who's now, I call myself a house cat because I don't get to go and interview people, I don't get to leave the office, I don't get to do my own stories, is you have to feed the beast. So like, if you hate that part of your job, tough. Like, you just got to get really good at feeding that beast, because the second part of that phrase is you feed the beast, then you feed yourself. And so, you know, what I like to tell the folks that work with me or work for me or partner with me is that you have to learn to write for the edit, and the editor needs to learn to edit for the writer. Because if you have an editor who doesn't respect your writing, you have the wrong editor. And if you have a writer who can't take direction and can't anticipate the kinds of questions and the holes that they're going to have or that they're going to create, then you have the wrong writer. And so you really need that trust. It's all about trust, right? I'm not going to give somebody 3 months on a story if they can't work a daily, right? Because what am I doing? I'm wasting time. I'm wasting our readers, listeners, viewers' precious opportunity to consume information that is of high quality. And so for me, the two most concrete things that people can do, whether they're reporters, whether they're gadflies, whether they're people who are interested in the community, is learn and understand the FOIA law, because that is not a journalist tool, that is the public's tool. And that will help.
FOIA, you have
Is
to spell.
Freedom of Information Act. There's a Freedom of Information Act here in Illinois, and there's also a federal law, which will get you to what I think we oftentimes don't acknowledge is part of the privilege of our reporting, which is the data. That's how you get from the anecdote to the system. It's the data.
But back up a little bit. What does FOIA do?
So FOIA is a means through which you can request public information, right? Most information from public agencies is deemed public unless there's a reason to keep it private. And oftentimes, governments use exemptions to protect people's privacy, to obfuscate shenanigans that they're up to make your life impossible, because they think that you're going to stop calling, because they know you're on a deadline, and you just keep going and keep pressing. And we have Matt Kiefer here, who's on the Chicago Reporter team, not married to me, but is our FOIA expert at the Chicago Reporter. We're very sad. He's going to California to take part in the Knight Fellowship at the end of August. But he's been in a protracted battle with the Chicago Police Department for badge numbers, because we have a database tracking settlements of police misconduct, and we need to match the cops to the shields. And they are constantly telling the Attorney General, told them, give them the numbers. And they're just slow walking it. So, yes! Yes. Well, so it's FOIA, because FOIA gets you to understand the openness and the interest that the public agency has in giving you information, right? It's sort of a test. It's like, can we dance? Really, how close are we going to dance? Or are we going to make this go, official, right? Can I just get that data? The other part, I think, is before we get to the investigative, oftentimes we as investigative journalists don't appreciate the explanatory element. We're out trying to bag the bad guy, and by that point, we're trying to incite the outrage for just how bad the thing is, without taking 4 steps back and helping people understand property taxes, which is not sexy or fun or interesting until you get to that systemic inequity. And so I think those two tools, FOIA and data, learn to love Excel, because those are the mechanisms through which you take those anecdotes and you mushroom them out. You validate assumptions, you invalidate, more importantly, assumptions about what you end up seeing, and then you see that Englewood is not just a black neighborhood, right? There's a lot of other elements to it that if you were not able to analyze data, you wouldn't be able to get at some of the more structural and systemic stories.
So I'm wondering if either or any of you could actually talk a bit about that balance between feeding the beast and feeding yourself, which is a great metaphor, by the way. So does anyone have any suggestions on how to find that balance?
I do actually. I was going to interject on the last question, so perfect segue. So it's not about an investigative piece, but for example, something that we did, I had a producer in Miami who said to me, we are going to have the 50 years of the Cuban Revolution, and I'm like, we are not celebrating that. We are going to make 50 years of the Cuban exile. And so he said to me, I want to do a documentary. And I said, okay, well, that's not going to happen because there's no way I can pull you out for this entire time to do. I mean, we had to feed the beast every single day. We had 3 newscasts, whatever. And so I said to him, but what we will do is that we will do 1 story a week. And at the end of this, you're going to pull you out for 2 weeks, because that I can do, and you're going to put that documentary together using all of those pieces. So we got to tell the story over the course of time and then put it all together, and it does give you that overall context. We've done the same thing here. We oftentimes have done stories when we did the temp agencies with you. We've done other investigations, and I just have to say, I don't want to take the credit for any of this because I'm the one that helps pull things out of the way so everybody else can do it. It's not me. I have an incredible team of people, producers and reporters and anchors who are the one, and assignment desks who deserve the credit. It's not me. But what we have done is they'll do maybe a 2-part story and then another 2-part story, and then we'll say, you know what, let's bundle that together. Let's preempt some other local window, or I'll ask the network for a special window, and we'll put all of that together into half hour. We did that for criminal justice. We did it for the opiate crisis. So we started to collect. We knew the content we had created, and the body of work later came together as more of a whole, more comprehensive. And that's the way that we've, I think, been resourceful and scrappy to make that happen. And I think it tells a very different story when you get to see all of it together, which is a reality that we're seeing. I was having this conversation the other day, is we're throwing out stories and bits of information in a way where, unless the consumer is willing to make the commitment to take the entire body of work and really understand it, because we're feeding the beast, because everybody wants it all the time, they get only bits and pieces of the story, because we are now putting out information in a way that we used to take the 9 months to sit there and collect it and then put it out as this nice little pretty package. And we're not doing that anymore. And we're not, I know I'm not the only one. That all news agencies are doing that now. And the consumer is consuming the way that they used to in the 1950s, when it used to be put in this little package and put in front of you. And they have we haven't done enough to do the news literacy part to help people understand how to take that information in the way that they probably do more than I do, and evaluate that over the 9 months that this develops. So
it sounds like you're saying collaboration. All of you are saying collaboration. Sometimes collaboration with people outside makes it easier to do these kinds of stories. And also sort of doing things in small pieces, in small chunks, and that's how you are able to actually accumulate a lot of really good work over time. I want to move on to segregation.
Can I just make one comment?
Sure.
I mean, so, because we were neighbors in California, and I'm fortunate because I am the beast. So I would encourage every journalist out there to become the publisher, to run your place, to know that that can be your place, because the beasts come in all shapes and sizes. And
What do you mean by that?
well, there's daily broadcast operations, there's public radio affiliates, there's daily newspapers, there's blogs, there's hourly deadlines. You can run a sprint or you can run a marathon. You can do backstrokes. It's just, there are different types of news organizations. So the idea that all of us are beholden to these unrealistic news cycle driven moments that don't allow us to take that time, that don't allow us to invest that time, is also not true. And so at the Chicago Reporter, we do not have a daily deadline. Right. We do not put out a newspaper. So if we don't publish, it's because I messed up. But our reporters are not constantly feeding this apparatus that like won't stop. And
So are you saying journalists should choose the platform that works best for their
absolutely
temperament? Is that what you're saying?
for their temperament, for their interest, for their passion, and if it doesn't exist, go make it. Because the idea that somehow we all have to slave at legacy news organizations to climb ladders, to have these unrealistic jobs that are 70 hours a week is ridiculous. We just don't have to do that anymore if we don't want to do that anymore. And if we continue to do that, then there will always be those systems, right? At some level,
Disruption is what you're
we
talking
are
about.
perpetuating the racism because we don't give ourselves the time, and Teddy and I talk about this all the time, because we don't give ourselves the time to make those investments, right? We shouldn't be the exceptions, right? We should be the rule.
Great, thank you for saying that. Chicago has long been a racially stratified city. I can say that because I'm from here. So originally, I'm from here. And some sociologists are calling this the city as being hyper-segregated. Can you guys, or can any of you talk about the impact segregation has on health, education, and wealth? And after doing that, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about how this story can feel so overwhelming to cover. I think it's an important story to cover, but how can journalists cover it in a way that doesn't feel so overwhelming? Because it's huge.
Well, I'll jump in. So the first part of your question was segregation's impact on all of these other things. And I imagine the room is pretty well versed on the depth of segregation in Chicago and the surrounding communities and some of the ways in which it impacts a variety of systems. But segregation has a profound impact, I think, in ways in which we don't even quite think about. So we understand segregation in housing, we understand segregation in our schools. Those are things in which we think about very clearly. But we're segregated by the nightclubs we go to. We're segregated by the restaurants we eat at. We're segregated by the malls we shop at. And if you don't believe me, think about, I grew up on the South Side, most of my childhood on the South Side in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood. We would go to Evergreen Plaza all the time, right around the time when people started calling it Ever Black Plaza. And so Ever Black Plaza sat on the corner of 95th and Western, right in the corner of the Evergreen Park suburb, which in the 80s when I was growing up was like 92% white. And you can walk through Ever Black Plaza and you might see enough white people that you can count on one hand. And the neighborhood right next door to Ever Black Plaza, was predominantly white. This was a place when people in that neighborhood would not shop. Now, granted, Ever Black Plaza didn't have as poshy the establishments that you could find at Chicago Ridge a few miles west, or in New Orleans Square, which is like a amusement park of commercial activity. But there was still, Carson's was there. There was, at that time, there were still, I think, 3 anchor stores there, but this was a place where people did not shop. River Oaks, back in the day, was a shopping area that was largely a white mall and became somewhat integrated. You go to River Oaks today, you would think that you were back at Ever Black Plaza. And so the community around some of these areas have changed slightly, but not to the degree that you would see what you see. Another example, the Red Lobster on 95th Street by Southwest Highway. That's like the black Red Lobster. I mean, you walk in there and you would think you were at 63rd and Halsted. I mean, there are nothing but black people in there. I walk outside of that Red Lobster, I don't see near black people, walking into their home or going on it.
What does that mean in terms of?
You know, I would love to be smart enough to be able to hit it on the nail and say this is on the nail on the head and say this is what it means. What I believe it means is that we are still in this community, and I would say pretty much everywhere, but particularly in this community, especially given our history and our custom, we are encumbered by this sense of going back to the point the young people were making earlier about racial identity and what that means.
And some people belong in some places and they don't belong in other spaces.
I think particularly with regard to the, I remember coming across a post on social media about the changings, it was a comment on to a news story about River Oaks Mall, and it was an older white man who talked about how he just didn't feel comfortable in that space anymore. And bless his heart, because I believe he really didn't feel comfortable. But I think that's the essence of why our communities flip and why some communities will never flip, unless, all the black people move away. There are assumptions that we make about people and about communities that we hold very firmly. And those assumptions make us feel afraid. They make us feel uncomfortable. They make us feel a number of things. And to me, that is the essence of why Chicago's segregation has persisted for so long. And it is evident in a number of ways in which I don't think we talk about. I would love, and I shouldn't even say this because I'm the editor of a desk that's actually looking at things, so just go out and do it, dude. But I would love for somebody to really dig into segregation from a journalism standpoint that talks about all these other ways in which we're segregated, these ways in which we can walk into spaces and we can see certain people and we can say to ourselves, what's happening here? Why does this look the way it looks? And one of the ways I think we can clearly ask ourselves a question to stop and ask that question is if that space looked like something at one point and now it looks like something else. Something happened. What happened? Was it a tipping point? Did they stop selling the right kind of food? What was it that made people say, I'm no longer going to this place, and for other people to say, all right, well, I'm going to go, and if these people no longer come, well, then I guess the only people that are going to be there are people like me. So
the way to do that story, how do we do that? I mean, how do we do these stories so that it's not so daunting?
I got a couple thoughts on that. The first project I did, the Chicago Reporter, was looking at, it was in 2006, so it was 40 years after Dr. King had come to Chicago. And so Alden basically said, I want you to do a 4-part series about where Chicago is now compared to when Dr. King came. And so part of what I did with that was I realized I really didn't know a lot about Chicago's history. And so I went day after day to the Harold Washington Library to the 5th or 6th floor and read a lot about the history of Chicago and how Chicago became so segregated, about the history of the Black Belt, about the history of Shelley versus Kramer in 1947, which then made the residential racially restrictive covenants, enforced them unconstitutional, what that meant for the neighborhood change in a bunch of different parts of the community, and how that had an impact so profound that when we started looking at the number of Latinos in Chicago in 1960, it was in under 50,000. And in 2000, there were close to 1 million Latinos, and Chicago was still one of the most segregated cities in the country. That's very powerfully entrenched segregation. And so studying that history to me was an important foundation then to actually start to report. Now, in terms of the question about telling the stories, I think there's a couple different things. One is it's really important to think of stories where things are working well. And that's important both because it can give people some feeling things aren't so overwhelming, but it also can be very important in terms of higher levels of accountability for where things are not working well. If it's possible to do it well here, why is it not happening in all these other places? So just one very concrete example. We did a story when I was at the Reporter about majority black nursing homes and how Chicago and Illinois had more majority black nursing homes that were 1 star, the lowest rated, than any city in the entire country, and any state in the entire country was Illinois. But there was also a 5-star black nursing home, which was the highest rating, just outside of the city. So we went there and talked to those folks to understand how are things going well here, so that then we could ask more pointed questions to the other places about why things were going much more poorly there. The other thing that I would say is that it's really important to build deep, trustful relationships with people in the community so they can tell you what's actually happening. So here I just want to mention again Reverend Hood. Reverend Hood and I met in 2004 when I was working on a story about opening the new Lindblom on the south side. And I met Reverend Hood, and he said, I am a community organizer, and my name is the Reverend Robin Hood. And I thought to myself, okay. Now, in about 2011, I actually got around to asking, is your name really the Reverend Robin Hood? He said, Jeff, I tell mothers, be careful what you name your children. But Reverend Hood and I worked together on a number of different stories about schools reopening, about fatal police shootings, about long-term unemployment, and then now more recently about reverse mortgages. And when he first came to me with this story about
Great
reverse...
story, by the way.
Oh,
I
thank you.
read that today.
Thank you.
Amazing.
you
USA
very much.
Today.
Thank you.
Check it out.
Well, thank you. Well, it really started with Reverend Hood and I got together, and we kind of like had a regular checking in, what's going on. He said, well, my aunt, who came up from the south, went to the west side, very common, great migration story. She's in danger of losing her house because she took out this thing called reverse mortgage. And so in the same type of question that I had that we talked about earlier with Alden, I said, well, let's see if it's just this one instance with your aunt or if there's something deeper, because he said there was this scam artist named Mark Diamond who enlisted African-American lady to go door to door, say, oh, we can fix your house, we can fix your porch, we can fix your kitchen. He would come along the next day, give a real heavy, high-pressure sale, and his aunt was in danger of losing the home. And so we went to the court records and saw this guy had been sued close to 100 times, stretching back 30 years. He had been featured on local newscasts. He had been in 60 Minutes. The Attorney General had said in 2002, I'm going to shut this guy down. It was 2015. And so we published the story, and it was about what that home meant to that family. It was in the context of black-white generational wealth, but it was also about what does one financial terrorist have to do to face any kind of civil or criminal consequences. And that story then led to Impact. The FBI raided the place, and Reverend Hood did organizing here in Chicago that led to people who were going to lose their homes, getting their homes back, Diamond being held accountable for paying the money back to the families. And since then, I've done a larger national story, and that's given me the context to say the organizing that Reverend Hood and Evangelist Hood and the people they've worked with have done really stands out nationally as an example of what is possible to do to address some of these issues. So those types of stories that both illustrate how bad things are, but then show what's possible to be done, they come very deeply from looking at the history of segregation, but I think then they also you can feel less overwhelmed, potentially, after seeing here are things that are going well and here's what can be done about them.
Excellent. Excellent, Jeff. Okay.
Can I add one
Just
thing?
real quick.
Oh, okay. I just think as you begin to talk about that, I think one of the things that this is for the journalists in the room, is like when when I hear him talk about that story, my Univision chip thinks is we have to teach and empower people how not to fall into that, right? And so I think you alluded to the fact of you have to take a step back and explain that to property taxes. We make so many assumptions. We don't do that because we understand that oftentimes they probably don't know, but I think more people don't know a lot of this stuff. And so if we want to end, let's say, it's segregation or discrimination or having our audience be victimized, the first place to do it is also approaching these stories, not just uncovering them, but talking about them from a solution base so that we can, and this is where I do believe in the legacy and the mass media is because we can teach people at one moment, thousands of people, how not to fall victim to what are these reverse mortgages, right? And so in your day, I encourage not just the reporting on it, but the looking for the solution and using that to scale is something that I think has been very indicative of our brand and works because we truly believe in the mission of not just uncovering it, but also being part of the solution too.
We have to start wrapping up, and then we'll open it up for questions. But one of the things I wanted you guys to talk about is action items. What are some action items that, let's start with the community, that community members can make or take to create a better engagement between the media and the community? Let's start with you, Fernando.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that hold us accountable. You know, if you're going to complain about the media and you're going to complain about the stories not being told in the right way, like call the newsroom, email, call people out on Twitter, call them out on Facebook, just put them on blast because nobody likes that, right? And if you don't do it, no one will. And so ultimately we are accountable to the public. It is the public trust that we are trying to foster and support. So that would be the first thing. The other thing I would say is we do not have superpowers. We are not superheroes. We are not magicians. We are just people who are very fortunate to get to do this for a living, which means we invest the time and the energy to learn about these complex mechanisms. So, you know, that's why I say FOIA. I mean, the action item that I tell everybody and nobody ever does.
Maybe they'll do it today.
Maybe. Is FOIA the FOIAs, right? So if it's a public agency, they hold records. There are public records. The court is exempt from FOIA because all of those records are presumed public unless they're sealed, right? So what Jeff was talking about going, like looking for lawsuits, like that's a classic mechanism because if there's somebody who's so pissed off, they're gonna sue, right? So that's the one. But the other one is if you FOIA the FOIAs, you're gonna see what other people are interested in learning about that government agency and what they're actually getting or what they're actually getting denied. Once every 3 or 4 weeks, I'll go on the Chicago data portal to the animal care control section and just look at the FOIAs. The animal care and control is the pound, and it's lawyers FOIAing the pound for information on animals that have bit people. I'm weird. But you can do that. The fact that you can do that means there are public records about potholes that need fixing, bad cops. And so if you file a FOIA that says, I would like copies of all of the Freedom of Information requests that you have gotten in the last 6 months, they have to give it to you.
And
right?
Is that a good place to find stories about structural racism?
Yeah, I would say because what you're going to end up finding is you're going to find Reverend Hoods. You're going to find people out there who know that this system exists, that know that this tool exists, and are using this tool, not because they're trying to convince their editor they have a hot story, but because they need to know. And so that will get you to sources, that will get you to people who are engaged. It will also get you to understand what that particular agency is doing. We're looking right now at retail vacancies throughout Chicago and trying to assess what has led to decades of disinvestment in low-income communities of color. Well, the information for the neighborhood opportunity, I'm telling Alden a story we're working on, and we're technically competitors, but we're family, so. I already knew about that story, by the way. I know. He's probably publishing it on Monday. And you know, we're looking at the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund and who have they given money to and how much money is it and is it making a dent and what is Lightfoot going to do about that? Is she going to increase the money? Is she going to increase the transparency? Well, in the transition report, all 298 pages of it, there's about 30 pages of memos from movers and shakers in the community who have actually written about the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund. Right? So getting into those public documents is incredibly important because that is the public record.
For community members as well?
For everybody.
Okay.
We are all taxpayers, right? So this is all information that will empower folks as Terry was saying, and Jeff has been saying, and Alden have been saying, to understanding or beginning to understand and comprehend these very complicated systems.
Jeff. I'm
Well-
gonna have to like keep it short.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll pass and get it on. That's fine. No, please. Okay.
Just keep it short. That's it.
Yeah,
Talk,
no,
but short.
I guess I would just say that I think of it more as what do we in media need to do to engage community. I think the points that Fernando's making about FOIA and getting into public documents are really important. But I think that it's really important for those of us who do this work to really go out and kind of be, on the one hand, ambassadors to sort of explain in certain ways how media works. When I first worked at South Shore, I would talk sometimes to community residents for half an hour. Then I'd see them the next week and they'd say, I talked to you for half an hour and my name wasn't in the paper. And so I've sort of learned to say, look, we've spoken, I appreciate your help. We may print all of what you say. We may print some of what you say. We may print none of what you say. But thank you very much for taking the time to do that. So I think for us, it's incumbent to really be out there and engaged in learning. And then similarly, on the other hand, to let us know what's happening, to share some of the challenges, and then together to think about what kind of stories we can tell.
And that's important, I think, for the community to remember that they are educating the journalists, that you guys are the experts.
Yes. That was pretty quick.
I just wanted to say that public narrative goes into high schools, libraries, all sorts of places, and invites journalists to come with us. And we give a news literacy talk so that you can engage. So any journalists who are here, I want to make sure to give me your cards so we can put you on that list, because you inevitably also find stories there and find sources there. So people call us to get to you.
Alden, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say along the same lines, engage with journalists. Don't be shy about it. If you've got an idea, any journalist cares about story. So if you've got a good story to tell or you know of a good story to be told, that will catch their ear. Now, it may take 20 tries, it may take 30 tries. Be patient, be diligent, but keep making your argument. If there's something that you see that you don't like, let them know about that. And you can strengthen your argument with data, and even if FOIA seems scary, it's great. Just throw any FOIA out there and get something back, and it feels like opening something up on Christmas.
That's true.
But you can also find really good public information available on the website. One very quick anecdote. I was curious about this. Is another story I'd need to put somebody on. So you know the whole rash of news stories about wilding, right? There was during the CPS spring break, and there were a number of arrests. There were a bunch of young people who were kind of acting crazy. But I looked back at the data. I looked for the times when there were the most arrests in the Loop and the near North Side, which is where these quote-unquote wilding arrests happened. And the top 50 instances over the last several years didn't include that week or any of the days that week when CPS was out. You know what the number one days were? Lollapalooza. No stories about people wilding during Lollapalooza, though, right? So the data can be a powerful advocate for any pitch that you're making to journalists about a story that needs to be told. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. Sometimes it's just downloading a data set that you can find at the data portal or somewhere else, or sending a quick FOIA and getting back really information. But be diligent, but be patient. We're challenged people up here. So.
Terry.
I will forego so we can get to some questions.
All right. Who is handling questions? Are there any questions out there?
Ooh, okay, I'm going to start.
She had a question.
Who? Oh, I apologize. That's okay.
Thank you. This is more of a statement, and each of you can answer this statement. My name is Lavinia Hood. I'm the executive director of Mothers Opposed to Violence Everywhere, and I live in the North Lawndale community. In our community, there has been 5 women missing. Out of those 5 women, 2 have come up brutally murdered. and 3 are still missing. The community feel often neglected by the police, who has labeled these women as NHI, non-human involvement. We feel neglected by the media, and we feel neglected by people in general, that we're not getting enough media coverage on these women. And as I said, 3 of them are still missing. It was our organization that basically did the research on these women and found out actually what had happened to the women. They're strangled. Some of them are being burned. It's just a lot of gruesome killing that's going on. So my really question is, what are you all's thoughts on that? And is that something that any of you would be willing to cover? And we are a patient organization that works with diligency, even with our youth. We've held 2 marches on this event in 2 different communities. This seems to be attacking the poor communities in general, and predominantly Black women and girls. Thank you.
Would you say the name of your organization?
The organization is Mothers Opposed to Violence Everywhere.
I think you guys have held several press conferences. Is that correct? Okay, because I know we have covered some of that. And I would encourage you to continue having those and making noise.
You've been doing investigations yourself. Have you found any patterns? Are there any reasons these women have been targeted? Those would be the kind of questions I'd have.
We think that these women are being murdered by a serial killer. And we think that there's more than one serial killer, not just in our community, but in all the poor communities. So, and we think that a lot of these women are women that just have issues, mental issues, from services that they didn't receive. But still, they are human beings, and they shouldn't be classified as NHI. That's non-human involvement by the police department. That's how they classify these women. Did I answer both questions?
Well, I got to give Alden credit for it. WBZ did a real nice piece on it, from the south side to the west side. And it's actually 51 women that will come up dead that's been strangled over a period of 20 years, I believe it is, 18 to 20 years. And there is some movement going on, and one of the problems is DNA. Illinois do not accept rapid DNA, which can come back in 64 minutes. And they're fighting, or they're holding back to keep them, they're making small strides, but we had to force from the community for to even hold hearings about getting the DNA and why they weren't solving problems. And WBZ did a good job of using those numbers.
Anyone else want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that we are, this is not an excuse, but it is an excuse. We are severely resource constrained. I often tell people that Alden is running a reporter inside of WBEZ because his staff is bigger than our staff. So, and obviously he's a mentor and a leader. And so I think part of what happens is and this happens with most investigative reporting, is if it's been done by somebody else, then there's almost like well, it's been done, so what are we going to do about that, right? On our level, what we're trying to figure out is we've been asked to map the clearance rate by district to figure out where.
You mean the homicide?
No, just clearance,
Okay.
everything. Burglaries, arson, everything. Because the person who asked me was like, I know homicide clearance is at like 33%, but it's going to be higher and lower depending on the community that you're in, right?
Exactly.
Because I guarantee you, if a white woman goes missing tonight, the whole city's going to be on Yeah, exactly, right? So we're at a stage where we're trying to figure out how to do more thoughtful looks at that. And we're not at a place where we can add to it. So we're trying to figure out, because we don't have enough bodies, how do we create systems for sustained accountability in the absence of being able to do story after story after story? Because we have 2 reporters right now on staff. We've got to figure out new ways of doing coverage that allow for us to extend our reporting capacity, engage the audience in ways that aren't just, we did a story, so we notched it. We're on record with that, so we're cool. Because then what's going to happen is we won't do another story for 6 months, or we won't do another story for a year, and that doesn't help the situation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
Next question.
Okay, this is making me stand up. Good evening. My name is Regina Armour, and I work in the community. I work with public education, so I have a somewhat complicated relationship with the media. I tend to have been disappointed because I feel like it's not really about stories that are, well, it is about stories that aren't told and stories that are undertold, but it's also about giving a fair shake to a story. So what I have found in the local media lately is that there's one side, and it's usually connected to that reporter's views, but then the other side doesn't get air, if that makes sense. Because I personally reached out to reporters on all the publications, and not the Chicago Reporter, I think, but WBZ for sure, and on the, you said Telemundo, Univision?
Univision.
Yeah, for sure. Never have gotten a response because there's a lot of issues around public education. But that aside, I will say thank you for what you do. I will have a request around calling your colleagues out for not reporting fairly, because a lot of times it's not about what we want to see in the newspaper. It's just about giving every story a fair shake. And so that people can make up their minds, because it's more about opinion. I'm sure we've all seen how media has changed into more just opinion pieces instead of just reporting the facts.
Are there any structural things that you think need to be focused on rather than?
A gentleman right here talked about, I grew up in Chatham, and I remember when 60 Minutes did a story about how Chatham was the top black middle-class neighborhood in the country. And I've watched it go down. My parents have lived on King Drive since 1954, and my mom's still there, bless her heart. She thinks it's gonna come back. But one of just a short explanation to why people have migrated to these places, why Evergreen Plaza went dark, and, well, I mean that in a couple of ways, why River Oaks went the same way. I remember when the anchor store in River Oaks was Marshall Fields. I remember when Litton's and Baskin's, a lot of these places, Joseph Shoes, they were out at Evergreen Plaza, okay? Some of you guys in the room know what I'm talking about. But I think just like Lollapalooza is a perfect example, and the wilding out of our kids, we have had so much taken away from our communities. We just want to shop at a nice mall just like everybody else. I go to Orland because there's nothing else left. Now, Evergreen Plaza has come back, which is great, but I find myself trekking out to Orland just like we trekked over to Evergreen Plaza because we want to shop at a nice place too. When I grew up, there was a roller skating rink, a community center, a swimming pool, a sports at the parks, and I'm missing something, roller skating, movie theater in every community. Now you have to you have to get in your car and travel for an hour just to get to a decent place to see a movie. So I think that that's part of it. And I think that that's the top of the iceberg to some more structural racism. Why were our communities gutted of all the places where people just want to have fun?
But in terms of education, you said it's one-sided, the coverage is one-sided. So I'm wondering, are there any narratives or any issues that are not covered regarding structural
Now you're gonna make me take
disparities?
off my mask. Okay, so I work for the charter school system, okay, and everybody has an opinion about that. But I worked for CPS for a few years, and I worked in Evanston for a while. But I will say this, I started working in charters because I saw people that wanted to invest in my community with new schools that hadn't happened in 30 years. And I'm like, if you want to build a school in my community, I'm with you. Okay, now they're not perfect, but that's not the story that gets reported. The story that gets reported is the busting of unions and the gutting the resources, and I get emotional about it because it's close to my heart, but I'm like, the Perspectives is about to open up a school on 87th and the Dan Ryan. That building's been vacant for 30 years, and it's a legacy building. That was where Johnson Products started, and it was the first publicly traded company on the NASDAQ, African American owned. But it's been vacant for 30 years. If somebody wants to come put a school there, I'm 100% behind it. But nobody reports that. They just report the bad stuff about charters. And now we're the Darth Vader of like public education. So I could go on, but that's
Thank you
the
for your
underreporting
All
that
right.
happens.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go to the back and then I'll be back.
Hi, I'm a public school teacher here in Chicago. I teach on the Southwest side. And my question is really about how do we get students engaged deeper? So I teach civics, and every semester we look at picking a something that the kids care about and really doing deep research. And they always pick racism because it's close to their heart. But one of the things that you guys talked about is this idea of how do we focus on one specific piece of the puzzle. And so my question is what type of tips can you give to engage students instead of looking at the bigger picture, how can we make impact on something that is smaller so that they can see change and not just find it completely overwhelming, like I'll never fix this.
So Alden shared a couple of his stories, ideas that he hasn't gotten to. So I want to share the one story I've been wanting to do for 5 years. And it sort of was it reminded me when we had the issue of the young woman who was beat in school by the police, basically the resource officers because of cell phone use. So back when I was at OI, I live in Pilsen across the street from Benito Juarez. And so I would go over there and try to get the kids to like understand that they can do journalism, and it's not about covering the mayor. It's not about, writing about the bulls. It's about the issues in their school. And so I was just kind of trying to prompt them about like what's happening in your school. And at the time they told me that the school had lockers that they had to rent for their phones. Oh yeah. And Venice is like, what? And I was like, how much do they charge for the lockers? And where does the money go? Yeah. And they all just kind of looked at each other like, I don't know. And I'm like, where does the money go? This is your story. So that's one, because I guarantee you that of the 600 public schools, not sure about the charters, each one has a different locker system and price. And what do you think you're going to find? Right? So that's one. The second is, and this was based on that seeing this young woman viciously beat, was learning that each principal at CPS gets to decide their cell phone policy, which is bananas. So I want to FOIA, and I was reminded of Mick Dumke's story, where they went to all the park.
Have them do FOIAs.
I'm telling you the story. Giving you the recipe. Mick Dumke, when I was an intern, they went and they audited the parks for which ones had nets on the basketball hoops. Yeah. Awesome, right? Well, like I don't have a reporter that I can send to all the basketball courts, but there's kids at all of those schools that can go to all of those courts because they play at them. So one amazing potential story that I haven't been able to do yet is to FOIA for all of the cell phone policies at all of the CPS schools to see how are they implemented, are they along racial lines, are they along socioeconomic lines, because kids are on their phones, right? And that's a story that will resonate to them, right? And it's not about the administrators, it's not about the union. I agree, so much of the education coverage is impossible to care about because it's about the politics. It's not about the classroom, it's not about the parents, it's not about the kids. So letting them know that their own insight, their own observation, their own experience scales, and giving them the tools to address that, I think is a way of getting them to engage, because otherwise it's abstract. Otherwise it's like the man, it's government, it's not a real thing, right? So the things that they take for granted, old people, people who are not CPS parents, people who are not administrators don't know. That's news.
I want to be at CPS tomorrow when the 12 FOIAs for cell phone use policy go in.
I wanted to add a couple things. One is that we have here in the audience Brenda Butler and Charles Jefferson, who for years ran Columbia Links here at Columbia College. Yeah, it's tremendous. National award-winning publication, brought together young people from all over the city, Maria, and they would pick a youth passionate topic and then really dig into it and in fact made impact. And so I would suggest perhaps that you three after the panel connect, because they've done precisely what you're asking with young people from all over the city and done it at a very high level. And Brenda's retired now, so I'm not going to vouch for her time, but perhaps she could consult.
I'd like to know if any of you on the panel, how you would look at, or what kind of insight that you would have in terms of perspective in how we report, or how intraracial issues are reported, and how do you attack that? And one good example right now in the city is around a high school in Chinatown, because you can hear reverbs throughout chatter in the city, but I think it's something for how do reporters of color really start to report these kinds of stories? Because I think it's one thing when particular media institutions, whether they be stations or whether they be papers, but it really matters on the take and how we really deal with some dicey issues and really break it down.
So I think the first thing you have to do is reporters have to take on the lens of whoever they're reporting about. It's a very difficult thing, I think, for people to even fathom, right? People want to pretend and go in and act like they're colorblind or as if their vision is neutral in some way. That's bogus. That's totally bogus. So I think as a reporter, you have to go in, put on the lenses of the people you're actually reporting on. And that means you've really got to look at any kind of situation from their perspective. That means really immersing yourself within a community, not just parachuting in. You have to immerse yourself and spend time in that community and build relationships with people in that community. And I think that's how you get more nuance and more context.
I was going to say, which is probably not going to win me a lot of fans. I bristle when anybody says Chicago is the most segregated city in the country, because I feel like that's a trope. It's true. I'm not denying it. But it's sort of like it doesn't allow for us to investigate and analyze integration, right? There are African Americans moving into Pilsen. What does that mean, right? What is Chinatown, really, right? For me, the test of gentrification is if white women are jogging, right? So I know I know. I'm just saying. So to me, it's sort of, it's challenging the convention. It's constantly asking the question, like, should we be covering segregation or should we be covering integration? And is integration a way at getting at whether it's actually a good thing? Is it really working? Is this, to Jeff's point, is this a solution? Because if we constantly focus that energy on the segregation, part of the problem is that you have to combat that bias in the reader and the audience. I already know this story. Next. Swipe to the alligator, the Humboldt Park alligator story, right? Like, give me the other stuff, you know? So I would just say challenging the convention is one way of getting at that.
I want to add to that because it's really beautiful what you just said. Another thing you want to think about is sort of deficit reporting versus the model that you're actually going after. So avoiding the deficit reporting. I think often when we're talking about communities of color, we're always talking about what they don't have rather than the things that they do have, or looking at the communities that do have it and then asking the question, why do they have it? So also looking at people who gain from something and asking the question, how and why do they gain from that, rather than just looking at the deficit.
I'll just make one other light comment. So my predecessor, Susan Smith Richardson, who's now at the Center for Public Integrity, encouraged me in this job to do that. Just ask the counter question. So for her, she was saying, why is black flight a problem? Why is the fact that we always cover Chicago losing black population as a problem? We don't have a problem when white people leave. We don't have a problem when brown people leave, but when black people leave, that's a problem. It's like, well, they are middle class folks are also seeking better schools, better communities, other opportunities, but the prevailing lens is that black people are leaving Chicago and that's a problem. And it is, but is it a problem with the way that we frame it? And oftentimes it inhibits our ability to talk about mobility and economic opportunity and the things that we would take for granted for any other demographic.
Just briefly, the Chinatown High School is a very loaded issue, and so I think it got covered in some respects with the whole flap around NTA, but the focus there was about this well-performing school serving mostly black kids, essentially being, shelved in order to build a high school that would serve the South Loop in Chinatown. And I think that was a narrative that people could wrap their minds around very quickly. There was a lot of activism around that. But beyond that question and that story still lies a need for this community who's been asking for a high school for a very long time. And then trying to say, okay, so the city is struggling to address this need while also meeting the needs of those African-American parents who are sending because a lot of those parents were sending their kids to NTA from several miles away because this was seen as a very good option and the school has performed fairly well. So the question for CPS is why can't we have both of these things? And I think CPS would talk about resources and a number of other issues. So there's that. But then there's also the story about CPS trying to dress up, I'll say this, and no disrespect to Tilden and Phillips, and I think there was one other school that was remotely close to Chinatown, but not like smack dab in the middle of it or just outside of it, to try to make those schools more presentable to parents in Chinatown and the South Loop. And they were like, we're not having it, There's also a potential question to ask, well, even if they threw a few $1 million into Tilden, would you still send your kids there? And that, I think, could get into some very kind of thorny, interesting kinds of questions as well. There's also the question about Chinatown itself as a community. And I think in terms of very insulated communities, Chinatown is one of them. And there it is literally a different place. And so for the families there, maybe having a high school that they call their own is really important and meaningful, and maybe on some level it makes sense. So there's a story to tell about that as well. We just haven't gotten around to telling those stories, but I think it takes for journalists to have a full understanding of everything that's going on instead of the thing that is smack dab in their face. And sometimes it just takes, I think, journalists who are very present to those issues, but sometimes they need a bit of a nudge and say, hey, here's a level of understanding you don't have, and this is great what you've done, but there's still a story to tell about why this community needs a high school and why this community doesn't want the high schools that CPS has offered them. And you should get around to telling that story as well. But there was a lot of fanfare and conflict and everything around NTS. That's why.
One last question.
I'm Richard Muhammad, editor-in-chief of the Final Call newspaper. Quick question. When you talk about structural racism was structured into the beginning of this country. So I think there has to be a real recognition of that. And also, how do you get reporters to look at the fact that racism in journalism? There were newspapers that promoted the lynching of black people. So there has to be some real recognition of history, I think, to really get into what's happening.
Well, I agree with your point, and thank you for raising it. And I think for me, the way I saw that play out to some degree in the second reverse mortgage story that we did earlier this year that came out in USA Today was the first story that Reverend Hood really helped me a lot with. Really, it was about Illinois, and it did lead to some impact and statewide change and so on, but it was really kind of an individual bad guy wreaking havoc on the south and west sides of the country, of the city, sorry. And then what we did in this last one was we got 30 years worth of data going back to the beginning of this program in 1989 to 2018. And then, speaking of freedom of information, our colleague from USA Today fought for months to get the foreclosure records of the past 5 years of reverse mortgages. And he called me after he got it after months, and it was the same kind of thing, just the message, I'm not going away until you give this to me. And he got it, and he said, Jeff, 60628 in Chicago had the most reverse mortgage foreclosures in the entire country. And so when I heard that same question that I was talking about earlier that Alden brought to me of, is this just 60628 or is this a more systemic issue, came to the fore. And then what we did was there's a project called the Mapping Inequality Project. And what they do is they show historic redlining. And so after we got the reverse mortgage foreclosure data, put it in contact with the originations data, we found that there were a small number of predominantly African-American zip codes that had an even higher number of originations last decade, and then even more foreclosures in the past 5 years. So we mapped those out, and then we overlaid that map of the communities that were redlined in the 1930s and 40s. So we took that historic perspective and found that it was exactly those same neighborhoods. And so that study of history allowed us to say that these were the same neighborhoods that folks had not been able to get a home for decades. After the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there was growth in black home ownership. And then this program, which was touted by Tom Selleck, the Fonz, Fred Thompson, as helping folks enjoy their golden years, in fact became the mechanism by which not only the pillars of the community and the center of the emotional life of the family, but the key element of the financial legacy was erased. Wealth was erased. And so to me this speaks, and your point about media needing to reckon with itself, I also think is extremely well taken. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the failures that we have had and continue to have as a matter of transparency, as a matter of historical reckoning, but also as a matter of building trust. And to me, one of the most powerful moments of that story was going in to Reverend Hood's aunt's home and meeting Miss Lily Pearl Williams, who was 88 years old and had the courage to tell what had happened to her, how this guy had taken advantage of her, and shared that very vulnerable and painful experience in her family so that then other people could have a different outcome. And to me, that really links what the students were talking about, where their final statement was, we're all human, with what Evangelist Hood, what you were talking about in terms of saying these women who are being killed in our community are being labeled non-human intervention by the police, to the point Ms. Armour was making about schools and then thinking about integration, really engaging in that profoundly human level, but with that consciousness of history and what the implications is for where we are now and then where we're trying to do going forward.
And if I can,
Is that it? Are we
done?
I think to be good partners with the Goodman, we need to go. But I want to ask one.
I just want to add one
Please
other
do.
thing, because I think that's a perfect note to go out on. And if you guys want to talk to us after the fact, come on up. No problem with that. I just wanted to invite you guys to really check out the book, because a lot of the things that we were talking about are addressed in the book, and it goes into much deeper explanation about things. If you're a journalist, it will be very helpful to you, and also if you're a community member, it will give you insight of what you should be expecting from journalists in terms of reporting about inequality.
And I want everybody to give Ms. Wagner a round of applause, because the book is phenomenal. The book is amazing, and the book is why we're here today. And I want you to remind you briefly that we talk about journalism. Don't leave yet. We talk about journalism as the it is the checks and balances and the fourth estate, right? And I want to remind you that you are really the fifth estate. You are the people who give the checks and balances on journalists, the community. So engaging with them, calling with them, telling them when they get it right, tell them when they get it wrong. Talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly without you as a resource, especially these days, because newsrooms really have been decimated. Without you as resources, newsrooms cannot do the stories and cannot get deep into the neighborhoods without you. So please help via Twitter, help via calls, help via whatever you can do. And I'm going to ask one more favor. Panelists, can I ask you to step down and stand in front of the audience? Audience, can I ask you to stand up? I want to remember this night, and that means you have to get in there too, because this is my last night here with Public Narrative, and I am so thrilled to have this discussion tonight. So all of you.